This is the Climate Academy Systems Understanding course, and this is Chapter 9 on paradigm shifts. Just like with all the previous chapters, everything which I'm saying can be found inside the Climate Academy student book, and this can be found inside the Climate Academy webpage and Moodle. And you just work your way through the chapters, this chapter 9, and you do the quiz at the end of this chapter and build up the bricks in your wall of systems understanding. Now, we've got to the point now where we have quite a full understanding of the Earth systems which are in play, the environmental systems, and it's clear that we are on a crash trajectory with those forces of nature, with laws of physics and chemistry. And it's really quite odd why we're not reacting more. Why is education not reacting more? Why is the media not reacting more? Why is our economy and our energy infrastructure not reacting more? So this chapter is about digging deeper into the human systems which are in play. And the word that we're going to focus on is paradigm. So a paradigm is like a set of background beliefs or set of background assumptions which often lie a little bit out of sight, but they have a controlling influence on the individual actions and the individual behaviors that we take. So this is chapter 9 and it's on paradigms and hopefully a paradigm shift. What is a paradigm? A paradigm is a framework or model of beliefs or assumptions which a group or individuals can have. And this background set of assumptions influences and shapes the way in which they understand or interpret or analyze the world. So it's like the background scenery to everything, but it's not just passive. This background scenery is active in the choices and ways in which everybody on stage in life interprets things. And we'll get to some specific examples in a moment. But I think the most helpful way into the word paradigm is to think about the difference between grammar and vocabulary. So right now I'm talking to you in English. This is not a problem for me. I was born into an English world, into an English speaking family and culture. I grew up with English and nobody ever sat down to teach me grammar, especially I was born in the mid-70s. So in the late 70s, early 80s, grammar wasn't a big thing in teaching English. The emphasis when I was growing up was more on play, the playful use of language. In fact, I hardly remember any lessons whatsoever about grammar, and yet I speak fluent English. My English grammatically is pretty good. I'm not thinking now about if I'm using the right tense, and I'm not thinking about the word order within my sentences. This just kind of flows naturally. I am thinking about the vocabulary which should come next, but I'm not thinking about the grammar. This is the background scenery to the action that is happening. Now, just give you an example of that. If you are an English speaker, you might be surprised to find out the very strict rules which are in play for the order of adjectives in a sentence. Now, if you don't know them, I will list them now for you. They are basically opinion, size, age, shape, colour, origin, material, and purpose. Now, I don't know how many of you would be able to list those from memory. I doubt a tiny percent. I imagine only a very tiny percentage of you would. Maybe if you're an English language teacher. And yet, when I say a sentence like the huge brown tapestry in the room, or the lazy green dog, slightly odd examples, but the point is that I'm not thinking about the order in which those adjectives appear, and yet they're governed by a very strict order. Now, I find that quite magical, that every time I speak and talk about things and describe them, these adjectives flow out in exactly the same order every time. I don't make mistakes. I just don't make adjectival order mistakes in speaking, and yet I don't know the rule. I couldn't now list you the rule off the top of my head. I had to use a little prompt sheet before. So, how weird then that this is something that I know, but I don't know. Now, this is the sense in which this chapter is about those background assumptions which are in play, and they're not in play passively. They are the very ground for everything else. They control everything else. They provide the framework to all the other details. And this is the kind of level we have to get to with the climate crisis to really understand what's going on. We have to get to the grammatical level of things and not just look at the surface level of vocabulary. We have to look at what the power or controlling forces that are in play in order to understand why we continue to go on this collision course towards nature, towards the laws of a crash with the laws of physics and chemistry. Now, I don't particularly admire Donald Rumsfeld, but when he was questioned about the Iraq War in the early 2000s in the White House, he came out with this now quite famous statement about what they knew about weapons of mass destruction. So here he is. Here's Donald.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
Excuse me, but is this an unknown unknown?
I'm not.
Several unknowns, and I'm just wondering if this is an unknown.
I'm not going to say which it is.
But Mr. Secretary,
I'm right here. I'm right here.
So in the climate crisis, there are known knowns. There are things we know. You can see that in the level of concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. This is very known. It's observed to a very high level of accuracy. There are known unknowns. We're not exactly sure how these Earth systems, because they're so complex, how exactly they will play out, on what timescales and with what speed, like we just saw in the last chapter on physical tipping points. And there are some things that we don't know. There are elements of these Earth systems which are so far out of sight. We don't know what they are, but they could suddenly come into play. And then we say in 10 years, we didn't think about that element of the science of climate change. And this chapter is about the fourth category that Donald Trump doesn't mention. These are the known unknowns. The things that we know, but they're out of sight. These are the grammatical controlling paradigm assumptions that we live with when we're responding, understanding, and reacting to the climate crisis. And they are fundamental, and they deserve our attention. Before we step into the later questions, let's maybe visualize what's going on here. Here is a blue and red box. So the red box at the bottom, that section of this diagram illustrates those background grammatical assumptions, and the blue big area above all of that are the actions or the particular events or beliefs or whatever that go with those background assumptions. And let's take a very familiar example. Let's just take a student's life. A student living his life in this blue area will get out of bed, do certain homeworks and try harder in those subjects than others. What do they do with their weekend? What kind of food they may eat? And what do they look at on their social media? All that kind of action in the blue zone is largely determined by the assumptions in the red zone. So if you have a story in your life as a student which says, I want to be a lawyer, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be a footballer, then those red zone assumptions will shape the way in which everything else takes place. And you don't revisit those red zone questions unless something really big happens, like, let's say, a failed exam or a successful exam. But those red things are just in the background, and they provide like a framework. They give you a motivation to get out of bed. They are like the glue in the story of your life about why you're here and what you're doing. And it's the same in science. If we take this blue area and we imagine this as a field of science, and the red area are, let's say, the assumptions of that field, well, let's take physics. In a Newtonian world, the baseline assumptions about Newton's physics are that the universe is basically clockwork. It's predictable. Newton imagines that the world is a bit like a shoebox with a clock on the wall. And that shoebox is basically rigid. It's got 3 dimensions. And time affects all the things in that shoebox equally. Time is basically linear. It doesn't bend or shift. And us as observers, like as physicists, we can look inside that shoebox objectively and understand the mechanisms like cause and effect or gravity and so on. So that is the Newtonian paradigm. And nobody, when they get out of bed to do physics, would question that Newtonian paradigm in Newton's era. In the 1800s, people were not looking at the red zone and thinking, yeah, but are time and space like really separate? Of course, they just assumed that was the case, and they got on busy with working inside the blue zone with practical experiments, testing those theories of cause and effect or gravity, seeing how they could learn practical things. For example, because of Newton, we understood that the Earth was not exactly spherical. Because of Newton, we understood that the passage of Halley's Comet could be predictable, that tides could become predictable. So in this blue zone, physicists were busy in the 1800s working out and applying this new set of assumptions, this mechanistic Newtonian worldview, which created this background scenery to everything else. And those assumptions were, in a sense, off the table. They were controlling, but nobody questioned them. So this is the zone for this chapter. It's what are the unknown knowns? What are the grammatical ways in which we think about climate? And although it sounds madly abstract, this chapter on paradigm shifts, in a weird way, this is where the real action is taking place in the climate crisis. When should I let go of my beliefs? Good question. And let's answer it with a story from my tragic romantic past. So I was 19, she was 18, I was at university, she was finishing her A-levels, and we had been going out for several years, and everything was great. She'd even just sent me a fantastic Valentine's card with little paper mache red paper to make a heart that was so big it didn't fit inside my mailbox, so it was delivered by hand by the porter, to much amusement around the breakfast table of everybody else. I started choking on their cereals. So things were good, and I went home at Easter to see Kate, and I picked her up as usual at the coffee shop where she worked, and as usual we went around a walk around the lake, and as usual we were catching up with each other, but the conversation didn't have its usual spring or bounce. She was not with it, and the difficulty in the conversation yeah, it was really hard going. And then she said, I think we should stop. So I said, fine, let's stop. There's the bench just there. Let's stop at the bench. So she agreed. And then she said, no, I think we should stop. So I thought that it was quite an equal distance to go back home by continuing forward than it would be to just turn around and go back from where we came from. So I explained the equidistance of our situation to Kate, but she just insisted that no, it was time to stop. So I, of course, thought, well, she really mustn't be feeling very well. So I said, well, we can stop here as long as you want. And then she started to cry. Now, up to this point, there is nothing inside my brain which is telling me that this is the end of a long, beautiful relationship. There's nothing in the particular words that she says which is a signal to me that this is the end game. So I have to take her words at surface value, like that we should stop. But of course, this is not working. So then I have to reach for an alternative explanation within my paradigm. And the alternative explanation is that Kate does a lot of acting. She's very good at amateur dramatics. She'd been in the school plays and things like that. So I just understood that she was acting and that she was pretending to dump me. And the convincing performance of this was really quite funny. So I started to laugh. And the more I laughed, the more she cried, the more she was stuck, entrenched in this phrase, I think we should stop. I think we should stop. And there was a kind of pivotal moment at which I was eventually broken out of my paradigm, and I had to consider the situation from a radically different perspective, and indeed, of course, accept that this was the end of things. So that bench, I know exactly where it is, in Bury, in the north of Manchester, and that tragic story taught me a few lessons, and one of them was about paradigms. Okay, I didn't have the vocabulary then to put words on it, but this was an important personal lesson. Now, let's skip to another topic, and in the student book, I give the example of planets because a parallel situation happened with our understanding of the solar system. We used to think that the Earth was in the center of the universe and that all the planets and the sun and the stars all rotated around Earth. And this model was an Aristotelian or Ptolemaic model, and it had served humanity well for hundreds of years. But there were some glitches with the model. Sometimes it didn't quite work. Some results or some evidence seemed to point, well, not in a different direction, but they didn't really fit the model. And these glitches kind of mounted up. And eventually, through the model that Copernicus put forward, which was then confirmed by Galileo's observation, in the end, the pressure on that geocentric paradigm broke it. Because there was a new model, a new way of understanding reality, which made sense of everything. Which suddenly all those glitches were removed. But the overturning of the geocentric to a heliocentric model of the universe required a tremendous amount of pressure before it actually became the norm, eventually became the norm. And the pressure on that data that resisted the new paradigm, that pressure was political, it was economic, it was to do with power interests, and the details of it you can find in previous episodes. But this Galilean controversy shows that at a social level, as well as like my tragic private level, we live inside paradigms. We live with background assumptions which can serve us well, but at a certain point we have to let go of them. We have to allow the new data to invade those basic assumptions. And that's never an easy process to go through. I can tell you, for weeks after I was dumped on that bench, the world was a weird place. And when Galileo and through the Galilean controversy, the world felt very weird when the Earth was not at the center of all things. So this is what is happening with the climate crisis. We are being presented with data which is in confrontation with our expectations about how an economy should work, what the future will look like, and just our understanding of what the Earth is. We find it very difficult to confront the fact that the Earth systems could radically change and radically change everything else that depends on it. So sometimes, even though it's difficult, you have to let go of your beliefs. When should I not let go of my beliefs? It's important to ask this opposite question, because the whole question of paradigms requires us sometimes to hold on to our fundamental beliefs and resist pressure from the outside, and sometimes it's important to let go of them. So this is complex. So now let's address this second question. And again, let's do it with an example from the planets. So I described in the previous question what the Newtonian paradigm looks like. It has a belief in gravity, that the universe is like a shoebox, and there are these laws of cause and effect, and you can even put precise numbers on this and precise equations. So that is the Newtonian physics paradigm through which, as I mentioned, we were able to understand the tides and the passage of things like Halley's Comet. But there was a problem, and that was that the behavior of the planets in the solar system didn't completely match Newton's predictions. There was one planet that was misbehaving, and this planet was Uranus. So Uranus, its pathway through the heavens, or through the celestial space, was behaving in a glitchy kind of way. And no matter how many times they checked and double checked their equations and their observations, Uranus's behavior was just irregular. Now, after so many checks and so many wrong results or bad results, scientists were really confused, like what on earth is going on? And maybe some of them at some point were thinking, well, Newton can't be wrong, can he? But they were right to hold on to the Newtonian paradigm and Newtonian calculations, because one very smart scientist, Leverrier, in 1846, he came up with a solution to this problem. He postulated in the abstract, he put forward the idea that maybe the weird, odd, irregular behavior of Uranus was due to another planet further out in the solar system. And he predicted that this planet must be there, it must be this big, it must be moving at that speed, and so on. And if that planet was to exist, let's just call it Neptune, then it would explain the weird behavior of Uranus. And so Galle, a German astronomer, pointed his telescope in exactly the space predicted by Leverrier, and there it was. There was Neptune. We discovered a new planet, not through observation, but theoretically first. It's a beautiful example of theoretical physics, discovering things before observational physics then confirms it. Now, again, the data for Uranus in some ways suggests that really you should have dropped the system. But they were right to hold on to the paradigm. They were right to hold on to their Newtonian assumptions. And through that, they discovered something new and something fresh. So let's just go back to a personal level. It would be a bit ridiculous if after 40 years of marriage, you went home and your partner had forgotten a Valentine's card or your birthday. And to you, this just, I think, well, I should be prepared to reevaluate my beliefs. Therefore, the marriage is over. I'm philosophical. I'm aware. I've read my philosophy. I've thought about paradigms. I'm articulate in paradigms. Therefore, this one falsification of my beliefs, I should listen to what this is saying. This is data that has to be acknowledged, and therefore the marriage is over on the basis of one forgotten card. That's for sure a completely irrational, over-the-top response. And on the other side, there are relationships, abusive relationships, in which there's such a weight of data which tells the person that they should get out of that relationship because it's dysfunctional, it's harmful, it's abusive, and yet somehow that data doesn't land. It doesn't break the paradigm that this person loves me or this person is good for me. So you see, through people, through planets, we are presented with questions about our background beliefs. When should we hold on to those beliefs? When should we drop them? And this enables us to think more clearly about the climate crisis. What things do we have to drop? And what things do we have to hold on to? What are our fundamental beliefs now? What do we carry into the climate crisis as background grammar? What are our unknown knowns? What do we assume which is out of sight and which controls this blue space? So let's put it back in. We have a blue space of all of our climate actions, all of our policy decisions, our individual shopping habits, and what we speak about in school and on social media. That's the blue area for the climate thing. That's the visible space. But what we're interested in this chapter is what is happening down in this red zone. What's happening at the paradigm level? What is shaping our actions? And I'm going to pick out what I think are a few critical ones, which are generally off limits or generally unknown knowns. So firstly, this is the idea that the Earth can't be hostile to us. The Earth is basically as it is now and it will never change. Somewhere psychologically it's very difficult for us to imagine a radically different planet Earth. One, for example, without the Amazon, or one, for example, without the ice caps. That's almost impossible for us to imagine. And it's impossible for us to imagine the consequences of that because they're so big. So we have a kind of status quo bias. We'll talk about that in a later chapter because it's got different ways in which it plays out. But we have a bias towards the status quo. We can't imagine that things would be different. The second is that change is linear. I think it's easy to assume that change is going to be predictable and linear and steady. But as we've seen in previous chapters on tipping points, that's not the case. There are different types of change. There's linear change, exponential change, and chaotic change. And the way in which we're funking around with the Earth's systems by suddenly jolting the level of CO2 to a level which is unprecedented in millions of years, that is a recipe for non-linear, dramatic, abrupt change. So we have to be aware or ready to think like that. We have to re-examine these baseline assumptions. A third thing that we struggle to acknowledge is that it's always GDP first. GDP is the first principle of all political economic activity. And the environment is like a sort of fringe thing for good people or nice people to worry about through voluntary actions. But the real action takes place in the economy and everything else is sort of a bit fringe. So if you're trying to do an event on climate in school, then you probably have to fight through these psychological barriers to insist that it's actually fundamentally important. I know from my experience in schools that if you want to have a trip out, to do a trip out, if you're going to, let's say, a trip for a science museum or a trip for something economics, like a visit to industry or factory, or an expert speaker comes in, if they are from industry or if they're from science, it's unquestionable that that's a valuable thing to do. It's quite easy to ask for time off or for the timetable to be rearranged for that. But if you ask for something on climate, it's more difficult. Now, of course, it always depends on the management and contingent factors, but there is this background resistance to acknowledging the fundamental critical importance of climate change. And along that theme, we have a kind of background idea of, let's call it, trickle-down economics. Now, this is a zombie idea. It's a zombie idea. It's not true. Creating wealth at the very top of the system does not trickle down into others. And it's called a zombie idea because it's weirdly still alive. It's like the Walking Dead. Now, you go through, I haven't got the time here, but if you do any economics on this, you'll find that that is just not true. Thomas Piketty, as I mentioned in previous chapters, his monumental book on the history of capital will give you the data for that. But capital creates capital. It's like a game of Monopoly. The longer you play the game, the more capital accrues in smaller and smaller spaces. It's not the other way around. And this accumulation of capital, which starts to buy things like media, starts to buy policy, starts to buy lobby power, those are the things which are controlling the system. This wealth, which has accrued into these ever increasingly condensed pockets, is not just sat there innocently in bank accounts. It's active, controlling the paradigm space, the media space that we live in, and the grammatical way in which we think about the crisis. And we have to be willing to look at that. This blue space is not just an open blue space about the climate. The way in which we teach it in schools, the way in which it's presented in the media, it is a blue space which is happening on top of this fundamental red zone, these basic background assumptions. And we have to be willing to look at those red things and to challenge them, bring them to the surface. Why might sitting on a toilet help? Well, this is a light-hearted section, and we're going to use the philosophy of Slavoj Žižek, a Slovenian thinker, who uses toilets to reveal these kind of background grammatical, cultural forces, which he says have to be in play for there to be three very different types of toilet in Europe. So he says there are three basic cultures in Europe, and of course he says this rather with lots of qualifications, but there's French, German and English. So the French toilets, they have the hole at the back. The German toilets have the hole towards the front, and the English toilets have like a wide bowl. And Žižek says that he asked his friends, his architectural friends, and why is a structure of toilet so different in these three countries? And he could find no explanation of that. There's no practical reason why you would move the hole around inside the design of a toilet. So Žižek speculates that there have to be some cultural forces at work. And so this is his idea, that the French toilet with the hole at the back, this represents the political French mind, the fact that your excrements have to be dealt with. It's the radical society. The shit goes in the back and you quickly get rid of it. The German, by contrast, the German culture is a artistic, romantic, speculative culture, and there your excrement is displayed. He thinks that maybe the first hermeneutic, the first interpretation of texts, like Luther and so on, the great German tradition of hermeneutics, might be rooted in this. In fact, Luther did have something about his own excrement as well. Anyway, this is the German tradition. And the British toilet, with its wide bowl, this is symbolic of the pragmatic English society, the economic British. Let it float, think about the possibilities, just be pragmatic. So a toilet, a simple object, if you think it through, can be revealing of kind of background assumptions, background psychological forces or cultural forces. Now, I want to do the same thing now, but with a word. And I want to zoom in. These toilets provide us with a nice backdrop to the word energy transition. Because that word is used a lot in the media, in public spaces, in schools. We use the word transition a lot, but what do we mean when we use that word? What are the background assumptions when we use that word? Because I think it is used very badly and illegitimately. Because on two levels. Firstly, it's factually incorrect. We are not yet in a transition mode. We are in an energy addition mode. We are not yet transitioning. Look at the data. Look at the levels of our annual gigatons of emissions every year. Those numbers are going up. Year on year, they're going up. That is not a transition. So the word transition does not correctly capture what is happening now. We are still in an energy addition phase. So why do we use the word transition? Secondly, the word transition implies a slow movement away from something. But that's not what we need. We need a revolution. We need radical action now in our energy infrastructure to get out of this carbon thing. But we're only talking about a transition. So on both levels, it's completely wrong. It's factually incorrect, and it's also like psychologically incorrect, and yet it's used everywhere with such kind of liberalness, even by those committed to climate change, those committed to achieving an exit. We have to think then about what are the background assumptions to our vocabulary. So at the blue kind of surface level, we use the word transition, but what that implies is that we still think that things are broadly getting better. It still thinks that we don't really need radical action. We can still tinker at the edges with a bit more voluntary action, just invite companies to do a little bit more. No, we are in the middle of a crisis. Our toes are right up against these tipping points, and yet for decades we still are stuck in talking about a slow energy transition. So just like toilets, the word transition, if you think it through, is revealing of our background assumptions. And the way in which we speak about the crisis, if we use the word transition and not addition, and if we use the word transition and not revolution, then we're missing the point. So this is why this chapter's there, because we have to drag to the surface and make explicit what our key background assumptions are. And sometimes just one or two words can do it, just like, for example, a toilet can do it. Are we locked into our paradigms? Well, as the example with my girlfriend Kate, or ex-girlfriend Kate, as we saw with Galileo and the geocentric, heliocentric universe controversy, and as we see with the climate crisis, with all these different background assumptions that are so dominant, it's easy to think that we can't get out of this. But we can. And this is a pivot actually in the Climate Academy program. Having acknowledged the depth of the crisis that we're in, acknowledging the planetary boundaries, acknowledging these tipping points, and acknowledging that so far we are thundering towards these thresholds and are not slowing down. We're not in a transition yet. It is difficult to get out of them, but of course it's not impossible. And what's critical is being able to bring these background assumptions to the surface, bring these background rules explicitly into the game. And to do this, we're going to have a little deep dive with a French philosopher called Foucault. So Michel Foucault was a French philosopher writing especially in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And a little bit of background to his life. He came from a very rich bourgeois family, but he rebelled. And this rebellion was driven, he says, by his the fact that his homosexuality did not fit into the cultural paradigm of the time. It was not acceptable. This drove him underground. He was forced into psychiatric care by his dad, and in the end, he picks up AIDS in a gay bar in San Francisco in the early 80s, and he dies. Like Freddie Mercury, kind of celebrity, one of those tragic celebrity AIDS deaths in the early 80s before medication and care improved. So that's Foucault's background, a kind of, let's say, a misfit guy in the time in which he lived. And I want to focus on the book that he wrote called Discipline and Punish. So in this book, Foucault makes a distinction between two different types of power: repressive power and normalizing power. He says that repressive power is very obvious, it's very visible, it's, let's say, performative. And he gives the example of a torture of a guy who had tried to kill somebody. And he's caught and he's executed. And the details of this execution are graphic. It is described by journalists at the time in graphic detail. You have hot liquid being poured into holes in the body. You have horses trying to pull the guy to be quartered into 4 bits, and it doesn't quite work, so then they have to hack away at the limbs and so on. It's dramatic. And this is repressive power. This is power which is visible, it's on the outside, it's performative, and it shows people who's the boss. Now, before we get to look at normalizing power, Foucault tells us the story that of how power dynamics shift and why they had to shift. Because the problem with repressive power is it sometimes incites rebellions. If you see a guy tortured like that, whilst it might make you scared, it might also provoke you to rebel against the system. So Foucault then, in his historical survey, moves to a middle phase. And in this middle phase, it's still explicit, but people are not executed, they're put in prisons. And he picks out the example of the Panopticon prison. This is a prison designed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham. And in these prisons, you have a security guard system where people are just under observation all the time. And you don't need that many people in a central observation tower to keep their eyes on all the different prisoners. And what Foucault says is that in this system of power, what the prisoners eventually do is they eventually internalize good behavior, because they could be being watched at any moment. So instead of having security guards going down these long dark corridors, you have this open prison in which people, the prisoners, start to monitor themselves. And Foucault says now we can understand modern types of power, because that internalization of expectations about good behavior, says Foucault, is what we can see in today's society. That there's a strong ethic of, let's say, good behavior in terms of having a career, getting a house, having a car, having a holiday. And that aspirational expectation creates a normalization of power. The norms which are entrenched in modern society basically prevent people from rebelling against that, because they almost can't imagine a rebellion against the system. In the first type of power, in this repressive power state, that when you have the king or the queen executing people publicly, there the target or the object of power was clearly visible and could therefore be rebelled against more easily. In modern power games, says Foucault, the power becomes subsumed into society, and it is hidden or camouflaged or embedded into social expectations. Now, he's not saying, and nobody's saying, that having these any kind of expectations are bad. Some expectations are good. But the point is that some expectations are taken off the grid. They're taken off the radar. They become internalized. And this shift from explicit power, from repressive power, to normalized power, to internalized power, where power becomes invisible, this is an important observation of Foucault. So how does this relate then to climate change? How does Foucault's observation about repressive and normalized power relate to the way in which we understand the climate crisis? Well, if you look at my video on YouTube on toilets, there I go into detail on how the grammar of how we think about climate is very often an individual carbon footprint grammar. Like, we think about climate change as individual guilt or individual responsibility, and we don't ask the structural questions about the massive fossil fuel companies who take huge profits from destroying the earth. And that grammatical level of things is hard to break out of. And it's hard to break out of because those things feel good. They have a virtue about them. So just like Foucault's observation about the good career or the good family or the good life well lived is lived within a certain paradigm. Well, it's the same with climate change. When you go to schools and in the public space, we generally think about good people in climate as those doing their best, like eating less meat, flying less, etc. But it's arguable that that is pushing off the table the bigger question, which is a question of structural and power games, which are really the controlling forces in everything. And until we flip or until we overturn our energy infrastructure, we're not going to get out of this. So being able to talk and put words on these things, like Foucault does in terms of repressive power or normalizing power, in terms of talking about paradigms, in terms of assumptions, unless we can actually put words on this, we're not going to get better. And to finish this on Foucault, this is what Foucault understood his work to do. He understood himself in a kind of Freudian way as bringing to the surface some of these subconscious energies, some of the subconscious controlling forces behind human society and behind individual behavior. And because people, like Foucault himself, felt a little bit like a misfit, he was rubbing up against those power dynamics in his own life. And that forced him to ask the more radical questions about power, about punishment, about discipline, and about how everything operates behind the scenes. How can we achieve a paradigm shift in climate change? there's no easy answer to this, but societies have shifted before. It has happened before. And it has happened when those fault lines of power or those fault lines of an imbalance or a problem break through onto the surface. So we have to be pointing at these structural problems. We have to get beyond the individual carbon footprint narrative. We have to get beyond using the word transition in a loose, kind of limp way. And we have to start pointing at the structural changes which have to happen. And to be positive, there are things behind the scenes which are already starting to shift. So just like if I would have been more attentive to Kate, I might have observed some of her frustrations. Just like Tycho Brahe, he was an astronomer that anticipated what was going to happen with Galileo. There are signals in the system at the moment of unrest, of where potential change could come from. And we have to amplify those things. We have to lean on those things. So, for example, in the insurance industry, there are now parts of America which are just uninsurable because of fire risk or flood risk. So the banking sector is having to now recognize in its spreadsheets that things are going to be lost. And once banks and insurance companies start to have it on under their noses on their own Excel files, well, then we'll start to see a shift in big finance. Likewise, the current war with Iran. I'm doing this in 2026 in April. This has exposed again our terrible dependency on fossil fuels. All of these geopolitical events, that these wars, would happen much less if we were not so dependent on fossil fuels. And closing the Straits of Hormuz has had a massive negative impact across the world in economics because the price of oil has gone up, just like in 1973 crisis, just like it was at many different times in our recent history. If we shifted to renewables, that wouldn't be a problem. We wouldn't be dependent on these despotic regimes for their oil supplies. Also, behind the scenes, there's a huge surge in innovation in renewables. These renewable energies are incredibly efficient now. And whilst they're not profitable because they're so good, the potential is there for us to move away from fossil fuels. But because we are subsidised still, governments still subsidise fossil fuel industry, they still subsidise oil and gas extractions, the thing is not shifting, but the background technology is there, is waiting to be activated. So on all these different levels, and we'll get to more and we'll in the next chapter, in chapter 10, when we look at social tipping points, we'll see that human systems are flippable. In Foucault's life, he couldn't have imagined that homosexuality would have become much more accepted within social norms. When you look at the way in which punishment happened in the past, you couldn't imagine that that would shift. So the way in which human societies are is volatile. Change doesn't happen in a linear way, and we're on the edge of this change, and it might happen just because the physical planet will push us into change, because the extreme weather events will just get so disruptive we just won't be able to ignore them, or our human systems will just start to wake up to the fact that this reality has to be dealt with properly. So we are close to change. We are close to a paradigm shift in the way in which we think about, talk about and act on the climate. And the Climate Academy exists in order to push us over that edge more quickly, because the Climate Academy program is dedicated to talking about things from a systems level and bring these grammatical hidden truths to the surface so that we can actually act at a systems level and respond to this in a way which can actually have a paradigm shift, not just an incremental or incidental shift. So that's the end of chapter 9, and everything and more can be found inside the book. Don't forget to do the quiz, short 10 question multiple choice quiz. That's another episode you can mark off on your way towards the Climate Academy Systems Understanding Certificate. And the next chapter is on social tipping points. So this chapter 9 has been on, in a sense, the abstract, on just bringing the vocabulary about paradigms to the surface. The next chapter is more human. It's on how human societies have shifted in the past and how we can learn from that to shift them in the future.